Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Dr. Olzer. Thank you, everybody. We're very, very happy that we had this wonderful collaboration with the Sabansi Museum for this big exhibition of Russian avant-garde. We brought almost all our masterpieces here from Thessaloniki to Istanbul. And actually, we're sad that the exhibition is almost over. And of course, we're looking forward to other collaborations. And you're all invited to Thessaloniki because now at the Momus Museum of Modern Art, Kostakis collection, we will be concentrated on the Russian avant-garde, and we will be showing exhibitions and other projects, educational projects among others, that have to do with the study of Russian avant-garde and its promotion, of course, always thanks to this fantastic collection that we have the luck and the honor to have in Thessaloniki. Okay. So I'm going to speak about art education and new approaches to art education in Russia, and especially in post-revolutionary Russia. But I will start I will say a few words before about the art education in Russia before 1917. So the first Academy of Arts in the Russian Empire was founded in St. Petersburg in 1757 under the name Russian Imperial Academy of the Arts. It was an initiative of Elizaveta Petrovna. It was founded by the Empress' political favorite Ivan Shuvalov, known as the Mecenas of the Arts and Letters, who was also the founder of the Moscow University. Already in the 1760s, the Academy of Arts had introduced a scholarship program, sending its most gifted students abroad to further their education, mainly to Italy, France, and Germany. In 1812, the Academy came under the purview of the Russian Ministry of National Enlightenment, which was like the Ministry of Education, and up to 1918, when the Bolsheviks came to power and replaced it with the Petrograd Free Art Educational Studios, the Academy remained a very prestigious school, but also one known for its conservative academic curriculum in painting and sculpture. In Moscow, the Stroganov School of Design had been established in 1825, an institution specialized in design, which was seen as the preeminent medium in the applied arts. Teaching was therefore less traditional and academic, investigating a new role for the arts, one that could respond to the changing needs of society. In 1918, the school became part of Moscow's higher art and technical studios, what was later called the Fütürizmin studios. It should be noted that several private schools were also active at the time in large cities. These included the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture and Architecture, and various art workshops, as well as separate painting art schools for women, which all gave the opportunity to young promising painters to learn next to renowned masters. In the 19th century, Russian intellectuals became philosophically and ideologically divided between Slavophiles and Westernizers. This division was also reflected in the arts. In the late 19th century, two competing art groups emerged, which became very active both in exhibitions and in education. The first group was closer to the Slavophile movement and based in Abramtsevo, north of Moscow. The second group, named the World of Art, adopted a clear pro-Western and pro-European approach and was based in St. Petersburg. The so-called Abramtsevo Circle was an artists' colony with the financial and ideological support of railway magnate Sava Mamontov. The circle, restored in that small village situated 70 kilometers from Moscow and considered by intellectuals as the epicenter of Slavophile philosophy because the estate was originally owned by the prominent Slavophile writer Sergei Aksakov, restored the study and application of the aesthetic and the values of Russian popular art and architecture. A group of painters, Ilya Repin, Maria Polenova, Viktor and Apollinari Vasnetsov, Isaac Levitan, and others, known as the Wanderers, in Russian Peredvishniki, took their easels out to nature to paint on plein air. They were interested in more social themes and organized lectures and workshops where they taught woodcraft, ceramics, and traditional architecture. The lectures proved very popular also with women. Following the same spirit, workshops aspiring to revive Russian popular art were established in the village of Taraskino outside St. Petersburg under the aegis of Princess Maria Tenisheva. In St. Petersburg, however, which, contrary to Moscow, was known since its foundation as a city of Western proclivities, a different art movement emerged, led by a group of artists who wanted to introduce the audience and Russian artists to the latest Western trends. The World of Art movement was deeply influenced by symbolism. Its members, Leon Bakst, Alexandre Benoit, Konstantin Somov, Konstantin Karovin, Zinaida Srebriakova, among others, under the direction of the talented Sergei Diaghilev, did not limit themselves to art, but also published a magazine and organized exhibitions, seminars, and lectures. The group was short-lived, however, dissolving shortly after 1917, when Diaghilev and the vast majority of the affiliated artists migrated to Paris. In Paris, Diaghilev continued up until his death in 1929 to organize the annual festival Russian Seasons, Les Saisons Russes, in Paris, which focused on showcasing Russian dancers and choreographers, thus also known as Russian ballets. By 1910, artists had become well aware of the unmistakable deficiencies of art education and teaching. During that time, were formed the Union of Youth, the first avant-garde society in St. Petersburg, which organized exhibitions and published a magazine with the same name, and ILEA, a Moscow-based literary group that marked the birth of Russian futurism and championed the close collaboration of the arts. After completing their academic training, several artists traveled to Paris to become familiar with and learn the latest trends from cubists and futurists. Russian artists and art lovers were acquainted with the avant-garde movements of early 20th century Europe, thanks to the important art collections of Sergei Shukin and Ivan Morozov. Both had acquired modern works of European avant-garde artists, and the size of their collections was unrivaled even in France. Shukin's collection, in particular, decisively influenced the work of Russian artists after the collector opened his house to the public, turning it into a gallery of contemporary Western art. His collection included, among others, several works by Matisse, Picasso, Gauguin, Monet, and Cézanne, which greatly influenced many Russian artists. Cézanne's influence was in fact so great that it gave rise to a period of Cézannism in Russian art. In 1912, many artists left Russia for Paris to study the arts. Among them were several women painters, including Lyubov Popova, Vera Pestel, and Nadezhda Udaltsova, who studied Cubist painting at La Palette Academy under two ideological Cubists, Jean Metzenze and Henri Le Fauconnier. During the same period, Vera Muchina, prominent sculptor and painter Alexandra Exter, studied at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in Paris also. Nadezhda Udaltsova noted in her diary, "After looking around, Popova and I began to search for a studio. Our intention had been to work with Matisse, but his school was already closed, so we went over to Maurice Denis' studio. But there we ran into a red Indian with feathers sitting against a red background, and we ran away. Someone then told us about La Palette, the studio of Le Fauconnier. We went there and immediately decided that this was exactly what we wanted." The period from the First World War until 1917 was one marked by upheavals, strikes, uprisings, and protests across Russia. Many intellectuals and artists in urban centers had been overcome by revolutionary zeal. This zeal took many manifestations, from nihilism and anarchism to socialism. But in the arts, it ultimately boiled down to one thing: a rejection of symbols. Rejecting the symbol was a very powerful social gesture, which from an ideological perspective was tantamount to a rejection of the old world, of all outdated concepts and moral values. In the arts, this eventually led to abstract imagery, transrational conception, and ultimately the elimination of objects altogether. Before 1917, the relationship between the Russian avant-garde and power was heretical and combative. The artist's hooliganism, a term used by Alexei Khrushchev, the futurist poet, to describe the artist's unconventional behavior, the anti-statist messages of their manifestos, their painted faces and eccentric clothes coincided with a tense atmosphere of perennial strikes, demonstrations, and pamphleteering organized by numerous students, worker, and political groups. During that period, avant-garde artists were indifferent to education, authored manifestos in which they attacked museums and dreamed of rebuilding the world and throwing Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy overboard from the ship of modernity, as the authors of the manifesto A Slap to the Face of Public Taste urged in 1912. Representative of that mood was the friendship and collaboration established in 1913 between David Burlyuk, known as the father of Russian avant-garde, seen in the center in this photograph, and Vladimir Mayakovsky on the right, both of whom were at the time students at the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture. The two friends would often skip classes and organize alternative actions to protest the conventional and academic character of the courses. They were both ultimately expelled from the school. In the 1910s, it had become common understanding that artists should follow new philosophical, aesthetic, and performative methods and experimental techniques if they wanted to advance art. And this effort should not conform or resonate with the current curricula of art schools. Artistic movements of that period, like neo-primitivism, cubofuturism, rayonism, analytical art, and suprematism, had severed all theoretical and applied ties to official teaching. The Bolshevik government, immediately after it rose to power in 1917 and during the time of the cruel civil war that followed the revolution, prioritized the establishment of new tertiary arts schools. As the first Soviet People's Commissar for Enlightenment, Anatoly Lunacharsky, assisted and advised by avant-garde artists, designed an educational program that brought the new trends of artistic creation at the epicenter of structural reforms in the educational system, with the purpose of changing the aesthetic, social perceptions and habits of the old world. The new regime believed that the old ideas and habits had been ingrained in the popular mind, and therefore considered it necessary to introduce an entirely new aesthetic to all spheres of everyday life, one capable of uprooting the old. In line with the experimentations of artists themselves, it was decided that this new aesthetic should focus primarily on the innovative forms and uses of materials, and only secondarily on content. This revolutionary appreciation of the role of form in the new aesthetics was instantly abolished when socialist realism was imposed in the early 1930s. By then, formalism was not only considered unacceptable, but also grounds to prosecute offending artists. Anatoly Lunacharsky was an enlightened Bolshevik commissar. He had studied philosophy in Zurich under Professor Richard Avenarius. He spoke several languages and had spent many years in Paris, where he befriended many artists and intellectuals, zealously fighting for artistic freedom and innovation. His Marxist internationalist philosophical approach was closer to the art theories of Alexander Bogdanov, founder of the Prolet Cult group, rather than Lenin's. He supported the work of Bogdanov, who that time was also his brother-in-law, and later of Prolet Cult, which emerged as the second pole of post-Marxist politics and was mostly at odds with Leninist theory. Lunacharsky claimed for himself the role of ideological instructor in all matters related to arts and education. Since he originally came from Ukraine, Lunacharsky was particularly interested in the future of young talented Ukrainian artists during the great hardships of the Civil War from 1918 to 1920, supporting the transfer of students from Kiev to Moscow schools. Among those artists were two important painters, Solomon Nikritin and Kliment Redko. Lunacharsky also successfully opposed the demolition of monuments and churches of the Tsarist period, designating a great number of buildings as historic monuments. Lunacharsky initially approached education primarily as an issue of free creative thought. We want faculty members to seek out and apply practices that follow experimental methods. We are not interested in imposing an universal model of teaching across schools. The diversity is what will show us the path to improvement, Lunacharsky had remarked in 1918, presenting his positions on public education. The influence of his ideas on teaching methods waned rather quickly because very soon the government considered it necessary to establish common educational standards as guidelines for all schools. But this change affected mainly primary and secondary education, whereas art schools continued for years to be institutions that attracted and disseminated experimental approaches. I quote from the appeal by the People's Commissary of Education of Russia, Anatoly Lunacharsky, to all who teach, from 1918. I picture to myself a perspective of the following sort. The Government Committee of Public Education will meet in an extraordinary session to work out the broad democratic basis for the call of an educational conventions of teachers and direct representatives of the organized working masses. At this convention, in a friendly and open discussion, we will elaborate the underlying principles of a new people's school in Russia and will submit these for confirmation to the constitutional conventions. We will create, in the spirit of education, an atmosphere of true cooperation. Here, class differences do not frighten us. A sincere and true teacher yearns for the perfect school which would transform the greatest number of citizens into completely developed men. The proletariat yearns for the same. The people has gained its freedom. It wants more light for itself and its children. I have been called by the Congress of Soviets, which represented 15 million of the foremost citizens, to be the People's Commissary of Education. I undertake this task without any pretense or pomp, but with a clear sense of responsibility and with a readiness at the first signal from the people to give up my post and join the ranks again. And I address myself to you, you men and women, teachers of Russia, to begin our work now. Lunacharsky established a visual arts section, initials ISO, at the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment, Narkompros. Artists took up teaching positions and painter David Sternberg was appointed director. Students and staff were asked to contribute in the introduction of innovative art theories to the education system. He also set up a society of painters, sculptors, and architects, initials Živ Skulptarch, whose function was to introduce a new avant-garde aesthetic in public space art. One of the first public sculptures was that of anarchist philosopher Mikhail Bakunin, created by sculptor Boris Kovalov in the style of Cubism. The active engagement of avant-garde artists in education and public aesthetics resulted in the radical reform of curricula in teaching methods at fine art schools. What is interesting about post-1917 art teaching is that it supported the effort to discover new manners of aesthetic perception, which were intimately connected to the Russian avant-garde. With the exception of the famous Unovis school, headed by the founder of the suprematist movement, Kazimir Malevich, most of the prominent schools advocating this new type of art education were based in Moscow and Petrograd. In Moscow, Lunacharsky merged two existing schools to create the higher art and technical studios with the initials FHUTEMAS, while in Leningrad he established the State Institute of Art Education. Now, UNOVIS was named after the abbreviation in Russia of its ideological identity, the affirmers of the new art. It was an educational organization consisting of artists and students and founded by Kazimir Malevich in the early 1920s in the Belarusian city of Vitebsk, in the early 1920, Its goal was to investigate and apply to the new theories in the arts, and particularly to the theory of suprematism. Another art school had already been operating in Vitebsk before Malevich arrived there, originally set up as an anti-academic school of fine arts with an emphasis on experimentation and the latest art currents. That earlier school was named Posnovis, which means followers of the new art. It was then directed by Marc Chagall, who invited Malevich to teach there in 1919. Malevich immediately embarked on the teaching and application of the theory of suprematism. One of his first initiatives in Vitebsk was to stage, in collaboration with futurist poet Alexei Kruchonych and painter choreographer Nina Kogan, a suprematist ballet performance. In 1920, Marc Chagall, shortly before moving to France, appointed Malevich as general director of the school. Malevich renamed the school Unovis, the affirmers of new art. He oversaw the radical reorganization of the school and formed a tight circle of students who became the heirs of suprematism. The members of this group were Elie Sitsky, Lazar Hidekel, Nikolai Suetin, Ilya Chasnik, Vera Yermolaeva, and Lev Yudin. More students joined the group later, including Ivan Kudryashov and Evgenia Magaril. Malevich was now asking his students to introduce suprematist designs and ideals to Russian society. The small city and society of Vitebsk would serve as a small-scale experiment. Malevich wanted to contribute to the formation of a new concept of socialist organization, one suited to the difficult period that followed the First World War and the aftermath of the Civil War. Instead, what Malevich achieved in the short-lived school was the formation of an art commune that followed its own set of rules based on the abolition of the teacher-student hierarchy. The Unovi school was particularly interested in the image of the small city of Vitebsk, and its members decorated building facades, shop signs, trams, and the interior of theaters and public services. The group branched out to other cities of the Russian periphery, including Orenburg and Perm. Unovi's students did not stay inside their workshops. They believed public space was the ultimate workshop, treating it as pliable material. The residents of Vitebsk saw the facades of their homes transformed, the exterior of their trams and electric buses painted, and proposals for non-objective sculptures proliferating. Film director Sergei Eisenstein, who visited Vitebsk in 1921, remarked that his impression of Vitebsk was that of a town covered in colorful confetti. Students would design furniture, books, and textiles, or work on interior and exterior decoration, always inspired by the philosophy and aesthetic of the suprematist movement, which prioritized form and non-objective art. Elie Sitsky directed the architecture workshop, designing floating buildings made of steel and glass. Students signed their assignments with a black square, the emblem of the school. They also published newspapers and other print material addressed to the wider population. Candidate students were required to fill out specially designed questionnaires that would reveal whether the candidate was willing to become an active participant in the school's experimental character. In June 1920, the first All-Russian Congress of Fine Art Teachers and Students took place in Moscow, and Unovi students made a dynamic appearance. Nevertheless, the school dissolved in the summer of 1922 after the graduation of the first students. Teaching staff and students splintered into adverse factions. Malevich himself and his followers championed more applied practical methods within the suprematist theory, working in parallel with the movement of constructivism, which was gaining ground in Moscow. The other faction insisted that the school should remain focused on the teaching of the suprematist philosophy and aesthetics. After the school's dissolution, Kazimir Malevich and most of his students moved to Leningrad, where he was appointed co-director of the State Institute of Artistic Culture, Ginhuk. Malevich brought his workshops with him and continued teaching suprematism. Although it was short-lived, Unovis earned a place in history as an educational model thanks to its innovative and openly and directly democratic method of teaching the arts. Now, the Institute of Artistic Culture, Inhuk, was set up in Moscow in 1920, And 2 years later, its sister school, the State Institute of Artistic Culture, Ginhuk, was established in Petrograd. Moscow's Institute of Artistic Culture operated from 1920 until 1924, with Vasily Kandinsky appointed first director. It was an artistic and educational institution comprising a society of painters, graphic artists, sculptors, architects, and art scholars. The institute was established in March 1920 as a section of the Department of Fine Arts of the People's Commissariat for Education, the Narkompros. Ginhuk operated under its own regulation and a joint curriculum autonomy. It maintained close ties with a number of other educational and research organizations and groups, including the Higher Art and Technical Studios, the FUTEMAS, and the Journal of the Left Front of the Arts, the LEF magazine. The Institute organized open discussions and conferences and was essentially operating as a theory center of the new arts policy. Architecture was combined with and complemented the visual arts. It was at Ginhuk in 1920s that the leading figures of Soviet architecture's two preeminent schools, Nikolai Ladovsky, the founder of architectural rationalism, and Alexander Vesnin, the founder of architectural constructivism, developed their novel architectural ideas. The Institute became a major center of constructivist theory and practice. From January to April 1921, the Institute organized an open discussion of artists concerned with the analysis and distinctions of the concepts of construction and composition. The records of these deliberations were saved by collector George Kostakis. Participating artists submitted various ideas. Some equated construction with technical industrial design and composition with aesthetic sculptural design, while others saw construction as an organizing framework for spatial constructs and composition as the combination of flat elements. At any rate, both concepts abided by non-objective rules, which means that their boundaries could be discernible, especially at a time when artists were trying to promote the utilitarian aspect of art, connecting it directly with architecture. The ideas expressed by Vasily Kandinsky, the first director of the Institute, were mainly influenced by the theoretical study of form and composition, without making any references to the concept of productive art or art in production, which had come to prominence by 1921. His views met resistance at the Institute, and Kandinsky would resign the following year, moving to the Bauhaus School in Weimar in Germany. Kandinsky was succeeded by a group of artists and theorists consisting of Alexander Rodchenko, Osip Brik, and Boris Arvatov, who represented the constructivist strand of thought and advocated the fusion of art and production. This group, with the later addition of Vladimir Mayakovsky, also formed the editorial core of the magazine LEF, the Left Front of the Arts. In 1922, the Institute became a branch of the Russian Academy of Arts until it was dissolved in 1929 by the Stalinist regime. It was replaced then by the Association of Artists of Revolutionary Russia, which advocated the style of socialist realism in the visual arts. Now, a few years after Ginhuk was established, a fellow student with the same agenda was set up in Petrograd, in Leningrad later. The State Institute of Artistic Culture, the Ginhuk, remained active from 1923 until 1927. The difference between the two institutes was that Ginhuk was structured as an educational rather than a theory and research-focused institution. The directors at Ginhook were prominent avant-garde artists: Kazimir Malevich, Vladimir Tatlin, Mikhail Matyushin, Pavel Mansurov, and Nikolai Punin. Many artists, many students affiliated with UNOVIS joined Ginhook. Malevich directed the Department of Painterly Education and was responsible for the theoretical direction of the school. Vladimir Tatlin was in charge of... Thank you. Sorry, but I'm also a bit sick. Thanks. So, Vladimir Tatlin, he was responsible for the theoretical direction of the school. He was in charge of the Department of Teaching of Materials. His department did research on everyday objects, and Tatlin invited his students to study and develop designs and processing methods for materials that could be used in industrial production. In 1925, however, Tatlin moved to Kiev. His department was reorganized and its name changed to Workshop for Suprematist Theory and Application. The new director was a student of Malevich, Nikolai Suetin, who taught the application of suprematist theory on three-dimensional objects, following the principles Malevich had demonstrated in his three-dimensionals series, the Architectons and the Planets. Here's another application of Malevich's Architectons to objects of everyday life, a coffee pot and a cup. Between 1919 and 1927, Malevich had abandoned painting, stating that he had reached the limits of this art and no longer trusted its representational values. During that period, he produced a series of architectural plaster sculptures representing imaginary buildings of futurist cities that he named Architectons. Malevich would name these sculptures using letters of the Greek alphabet: alpha, beta, gamma, delta, etc. His three-dimensional planets that followed were references to imaginary residential space stations. Ginhook also had a department of organic education, directed by painter and musician Mikhail Matyushin. Matyushin applied methods based on the science of psychology about the perception of space and color. And he also used the method of synesthesia, in which all senses should be activated to inquire the relationship between man and nature, and connected painting to music. In 1909, Matyushin became affiliated to the Union of the Youth in St. Petersburg, one of the first experimented art groups of the Russian avant-garde. The term organic education or organic culture was based on the theory that the world is a strictly structured system, and the artist can only represent it after perceiving its biological rhythm and inquiring its realistic space, not in the visible reality, but in the microcosm and the macrocosm. The four Ender siblings, Boris, Maria, and Ksenia, and Yuri Ender, which you see in the picture on the left, and Nikolai Greenberg, were his assistants at the department. The artists of the department would conduct biological research, combined with music lessons and concentration exercises aimed at perfecting the senses and mastering what Matyushin called the advanced vision. Ginhook was dissolved in 1926, and Malevich first moved his course to the State Institute of Art History, where he continued for some time his studies on suprematist architecture. He later joined the Russian State Museum, which operated a specialized experimental workshop, And Malevich continued his teaching of suprematist theory, but by 1927 he returned to representational art, creating paintings that contemporary art historians now label as post-suprematist. In fact, Malevich was forced to close the institute after Ginhook was heavily criticized for being a cloister where artists lived in isolation without contributing anything essential to the promotion of socialism. The higher art and technical studios were established in Moscow in 1920, almost concurrently with the Institute of Artistic Studies, and remained active until 1927. This specialized institution offered higher art and technical training to artists who had already completed their first degree. The Vkhutemas studios further developed the ideas that had been conceived at the Institute of Artistic Education, the INHUK. Vkhutemas's purpose was to prepare qualified master artists to work in industry and architecture, and as teachers capable of directing and leading the new type of Soviet art education. The Vkhutemas studios reflected the debate about the new applied role of art in industry and graphic design. This new type of art was called productive and was considered as the second stage of the constructivist movement, which aspired to the practical application of constructivist theory. Vkhutemas was formed by the merger of two previous schools, the Moscow School of Painting, Sculpture and Architecture and the Stroganov School of Applied Arts, by a decree issued by Vladimir Lenin, who had called for the preparation of artists who would become involved in a creative and innovative way in industrial design. And there is a testimony, there are several actual testimonies of students of the Vkhutemas studios that saw Lenin unexpectedly visiting the studio and asking from the students, having a discussion, an open discussion with the students and asking them their opinion about the new art and the education of the arts for the new, for the creation of the new socialist system community. The art faculty taught courses in graphics, sculpture and architecture, while the industrial faculty taught courses in printing, ceramics, woodworking, metalworking and textile design. Initially, the workshops also taught the theory of suprematism, but before long, constructivism was the primary art movement that influenced education at the studios. Students were taught special courses in color and chromatics. The power and application of plastic form, volume and color in public space, while special attention was given to construction. The courses were taught by prominent avant-garde artists, including Gustav Kloutsis, Lyubov Popova, Alexander Rodchenko, Ivan Klyun, Nadezhda Udaltsova, and Alexander Devrim. In 1922, Gustav Kloutsis, in his capacity as a member of a team of productive art at the Institute of Artistic Culture and a teacher at Vkhutemas, undertook to design a series of agitprop kiosks. Okay, these are some editions of Vkhutemas here. Agitprop kiosks, which were meant to be light, collapsible constructions equipped with audiovisual systems, deployable in public spaces. The vast majority of these kiosks were never implemented, but were considered nevertheless important examples of the relationship between art and production. This was the primary task of the studios, given that they aspired to prepare a new type of artist, one capable of transforming the aesthetics of the daily life of the new Soviet citizen creating simple, clean-cut, and functional forms, free of superfluous decorations. After 1920, a museum policy began to be implemented, and the first museums of contemporary art in the world, entitled Museums of Painting or Museums of Artistic Culture, were established. At the same time, exhibitions of experimental art were highly supported. The space study course gave new plastic possibilities to artists and brought them close to architecture. In fact, if something remained from the Russian avant-garde in the 1930s and also in the 1940s, and is still alive, it is the constructivist architecture, examples of which you can see here. In 1926, the studios were replaced by the Higher Artistic and Technical Institute, the Fütürizmin, which remained active until 1930. Shortly before, the campaign against formalism in Russian art had begun to earnest, culminating with the total imposition of socialist realism in 1934. Fütürizmin's curriculum, which remained faithful to the teaching of constructivism in the spirit of the earlier schools, was now designated unconventional and not conforming to the official state policy of socialist aesthetic. It was dissolved by decree in 1930. Students were reassigned to new schools specialized in specific subjects, painting, architecture, industrial design, and printing, such as the Institute of Proletarian Visual Arts, the Academic Institute of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture, and the Engineering Institute. The teaching of avant-garde theories was officially abolished. In fact, in the spirit of socialist realism, a few years later, the two major visual art schools of Moscow and Leningrad would be renamed after Vasily Surikov and Ilya Repin, two preeminent painters of mid-19th century critical realism. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, my name is Andreas Takis, and I have the honor to be the chairman of the board of directors of MOMUS, the Metropolitan Organization of Museum of Visual Arts in Thessaloniki. It is a really big honor for me to be invited here at the Sabanci Museum, which I thank from the deep of my heart, as well as Mrs. Olcher for the very kind invitation and for hosting us. And I'm happy also because Maria, from what she said and the way she finished off her speech, her lecture, passes me the issue directly to point some subjects which are more political and, I'm afraid, also kind of philosophical. So please excuse my technical and dark lingo. So what I would like to discuss briefly, believe me, with you today, is a very famous dictum by Walter Benjamin. Because, you know, for decades now, critical art theory seems irretrievably fascinated with Walter Benjamin's analysis on the aesthetics of fascism. As it is too well known, his seminal essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, concludes with a still mesmerizing formula, counterposing communism's politicization of art to fascism's aesthetization of politics. Fascism deflects the masses' craving for social emancipation by channeling their detonation in the destructive self-enjoyment of Italian futurism. Some works of which you can see on the presentation. On the contrary, communism promises the actualization of this craving for justice and property through a reversal of this relation between art and politics. More specifically, Benjamin notes, the growing proletarianization of modern man and the increasing formation of masses are two aspects of the same process. Fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting property structure, which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism seeks to give to the masses an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is therefore the introduction of aesthetics into political life. Fiat ars et pereat mundus, says fascism. And as Marinetti admits, fascism expects war to supply the artistic gratification of a sense perception that has been changed by technology. This is evidently the consummation of l'art pour l'art, art for the sake of art. Mankind's self-alienation, says finally Benjamin, has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. This is the situation of politics which fascism is rendering aesthetic. Communism, concludes Benjamin, responds by politicizing art. Unfortunately, Benjamin stops short of being more explicit about what such politicization of art would consist in. Neither does he provide us with any clue on whether he was actually referring to any specific contemporary artistic movement among the many proclaiming their Marxist or otherwise communist inspiration. Yet, for all those interested in the artistic production of the Russian avant-garde during the first year of the revolution, it is difficult to avoid the question whether this, the Russian avant-garde, may have been what Benjamin had in mind when talking about politicized art. Benjamin had actually visited the USSR during the winter of 1926 to 1927. He had some slight artistic acquaintances and was aware of the clash of the left group that Maria noted beforehand, with the rising nomenclatura of Soviet artists and writers. Still, Benjamin does not offer any insight on the importance of the avant-garde artists that we're talking about. Moreover, his essay on the mechanized work of art appears only in 1936. That is, at a time when the coercive dogma of socialist realism was already long established. Therefore, one could even entertain the thought that Benjamin's cryptic reference to communist art was meant only as a flatly descriptive observation, not as a hint of a normative project. Yet Benjamin is invariably taken nowadays as commending communism's attitude towards art and polemically balancing communism against fascist aesthetization of art, of politics, sorry. But given the pragmatics of his writing, his famous essay, such an interpretation is probably true, that he was commending communism and the politicization of art. And for that purpose, one does not even need a specific reference to some instance of communist art. One need not think that what Benjamin was commending was the authoritarian Stalinist politics of the canonization of art. He was probably, Benjamin, merely pointing to an abstract normative direction laden with emancipatory promises. Yet, I intend, to what I have to say next, to dispute the emancipatory capacity of the politicization of art. Without ascribing to Benjamin any intention to glorify Stalinism in the arts, his famous position would actually be more true if read descriptively. Politicization of art is instantiating a reverse, yet equally authoritarian attitude of politics towards art. The Russian avant-garde did embody an emancipatory strategy in its inextricably intertwined artistic and political endeavors. This is why my concern here is to dispel the idea that many may easily entertain that it is the Russian avant-garde that we should have in mind when talking about communism's politicization of art. Let me first note that Benjamin is rather inaccurate in ascribing to the function of the aesthetization of politics the label l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. Of course, there is a geste, a nod of futility in such aesthetization. However, this feeling is due to the futility of doing everything, even the most important things, and especially politics, only for the sake of art. L'art pour l'art is rather expressive of autonomist attitudes toward the art-politics relation. And we are well aware that the Italian futurists, just like many early modernist art movements, the Russian avant-garde included, were programmatically denying the conventional divide between art and real life. They were aiming at the subversion of the social isolation of an existentialist, they were aiming, all of them, at the subversion of social isolation as an existential condition for artists. Sorry, because I'm kind of sick too. So, that aim of subversion of the condition of artists is explaining also their deep entanglement with politics. What was rather lying underneath the idea of aesthetization of politics, both as an artistic as well as a socio-political function, was the subjection of political action to a new norm of aesthetic achievement with universalistic aspirations. Everything should be made or acted upon as a work of art, aiming ultimately at the achievement of one's existential self-exaltation. Through this attitude, fascism was rehabilitating, in a sense, the old romantic ideal of turning real life into artwork. Therefore, aestheticization of politics is not falling under the idea of l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake, but rather under the one of tout pour l'art, everything for art's sake. I consider this important because it makes away with a philological cloud obscuring the issue which Benjamin rightly points to. And this, what is getting obscured, is what we may call the teleological structure of the process or of the function which aesthetization imposes between politics and art. Everything, I'm explaining teleological structure, everything, politics included, are made or exist for a telos, for the sake of art. This structure is, relatively at least, content independent. It turns the relation between the two terms into a relation of service, or more plainly, of servitude. The meaning, the value, or even the mere existence of the one is justified solely by the necessity of realizing the other as a higher good. And this is, by the way, what the ancients were meaning by ars or techni. Teleological conceptions were widely influential in the 19th century social and political theory. And they were inspiring much of contemporary politics, either of a reformist or a revolutionary flavor. Social change in its most activist version, that is, revolution, came increasingly to be viewed as a technology, which also implies its availability for a plurality of exercises of self or collective assertion. This tendency in political theory and action has been particularly reinforced by the blankist or the anarchical line of radical thought, which deeply influenced not only Lenin's new party theory, but also Mussolini's reading of Georges Sorel's thought on violence. Collective exaltation in violent action such as a general strike or the overthrowing of government by an armed mob, was understood as offering a deep emotional meaning of vitalistic self-assertion and aesthetic value. It's like reading, in a sense, Machiavelli's Il Principe as a treatise on the beautiful. And this is exactly what Mussolini literally did. He established il colpo di Stato, le coup d'etat, among the Beaux-Arts. There is definitely a promise of jouissance, of aesthetic enjoyment in achieving the condition described by Marinetti as hygienics of the world, especially when those hygienics are brought about by thunderous and shining war machinery. We know it too well thanks to Marvel Comics anyway. At the same time, as Hannah Arendt has aptly noted, it is an unmistaken sign of a totalitarian situation to completely deny anything that would resist its being used for the sake of something else as of higher value. Because allowing such a thing would allow everyone to claim a power in determining what is worth-like, instead of leaving this to an elite or even a single individual which charismatically intuits of the true good or of the real scientific telos. The reason I am insisting on the independence, on the content independence of teleological structure, is the fact that this structure seems like also determining and infecting with its evil implications the second horn of Benjamin's dictum, communism's politicizing of art. Because the very rhetorical juxtaposition of the two parts, of the two horns of the dictum, imposes the reading of the second one as a direct reversal of the first. That is, politicizing art needs to be meant as subjecting art to politics as a goal of higher value, making it, in any way possible, subservient to a political cause. And in view of the mid-war context, such cause can be no other than the world communist revolution. We are aware that avant-garde artists, which Maria reminded it to us many times before, were themselves intensely politicized in the sense that they were actively taking part in the sequence of dramatic political events that came to be known as the Russian Revolution. As Trotsky has fancifully said, Russian futurists, you saw them before in pictures, didn't enter the revolution, they rather fell on it. But we know also that their political sympathies have always been lying with anarchists whose leaflets and journals they were filling with their manifestos and polemics, as late as the beginning of the 1920s. But here we're obviously less concerned with personal political militancy and much more with the artistic production of the avant-garde. That is, we are rather concerned with the influence or the normative direction that taking up the communist cause had on their work and its artistic value. For such an influence to be cast in teleological terms, politics have to be taken as a domain of human activity separate and at the same time far exceeding in value that of art. Art must be axiologically subjected to politics, which politics assume in turn the directive role. By getting politicized, art is to serve politics, and more specifically, serve the political agenda set by the dominant player in the building up of future socialism. That is, the organized vanguard of the working class, the Communist Party. The intensity of such subservient role can be nuanced by taking into account whether it relates either to the artistic content, that is, symbolic or narrational representation, or to style, artistic form itself, and ultimately, artistic value. In view of this analytical distinction, it is only obvious that Russian avant-garde artists did put themselves at the service of the revolution. During its first heroic years, they devoted themselves intensively to the active support of building up the new Soviet state by even assuming official posts at the Narkompros, the ministry, we would say now, of culture, the Soviet Ministry of Culture, People's Commissariat of Culture. Their partisanship was directly reflected in their own artwork, which shifted quickly from easel painting to propaganda posters, monumental constructions, festival decorations, etc., etc., etc. Yet it would be an extreme exaggeration for anyone to maintain that the Russian avant-garde artists had thus subjected their artistic style and attitude to the political agenda of the ruling Bolsheviks. On the contrary, their artistic direction was taking the form of a political agenda of its own, which was overlapping and converging with that of the Bolsheviks. It is significant that the Bolsheviks, resisted intensively their accepting the avant-gardists as the official or even the exemplary Soviet revolutionary art. And the Bolsheviks did so by professing adherence to an almost liberal conception of the necessity of freedom of artistic expression, which in 1924 even took the form of decision of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party on party's policy concerning the sphere of literature. In reality, the Bolsheviks' reservations were due rather to political antagonism and insecurity, just like in the case of prolet cult, Bogdanov's prolet cult, which was causing such intense concerns in Lenin about its growing numbers and influence. They had almost, prolet cult arrived to have 3 times the number of members, 3 times the number of members of those of the Communist Party. Most of all, one should consider that Russian avant-garde artists were conceiving of themselves as serving the social cause in a sense which eludes the teleological point of view. They were not just being instrumental for the Soviet Revolution to reach the collective goal of classless society. They were taking themselves as making the revolution. That is, they were actualizing the socialist cause of building up a new society for a new type of man. What makes the whole difference in the distinction between serving and actualizing a political project is who sets the political agenda into which artistic style has been programmatically transfused. Instruments serve a despot, while actualizers of a common cause act in horizontal synergy within the multitude. No one suits better this role of artistic actualizers of a political project than the so-called constructivists. In their eyes, renouncing the conventional real-life art divide coincided with their making the socialist revolution real through their artwork. As you saw today earlier in this museum, their work dispensed with the conventional safety of the cadre, the pedestal, the stage, the orchestra, and was implemented in space, structured in a way capable of serving an abstract and sometimes inscrutable social expediency. These works are constructions, human artifacts meant for ideal, imagined, projected, or at any rate, abstract human uses, preferably capable of serving revolutionary action, such as propaganda platforms, as we just saw, or tending to the needs of ordinary people, clothes, fabrics, apparel, and so on. This element of abstraction in the imagined or the ideal utilitarian function preserves, finally, their connection with their suprematist origins. But these works, fusing simultaneously political and aesthetic action, were the result of experimenting with and designing a new aesthetic universe, a new world, one that had to be consciously and responsibly produced in order to serve humanity and its needs. In this sense, their artwork embodied a crucial normative and programmatic dimension. Holding significant administrative positions and involved in institutions mobilizing productive forces, it was no time before Russian avant-garde artists started interpreting their task of building a new aesthetic universe as a venture to technically produce and give material form to this new world. Without abandoning the abstract nature of the experimental investigations, they turned their attention away from monumental art towards the design of specific everyday items that were meant for immediate and often massive industrial production. This turned to productivism, about which Maria told us a few things beforehand, or productive art, so to fuse aesthetic value with the elements of utility, viability, functionality, and simplicity. Clothes, fabrics, utensils, appliances, apparel produced under this philosophy would join forces with the new public space architecture and decoration to create the new aesthetic ecosystem, the new social reality liberated from its previous deceptiveness, fetishism. Thus, constructivists, or rather productivists, that special group, were proclaiming that the art of proletariat is not a holy shrine where things are lazily regarded, but work, a factory which produces new artists' things. Yet this painstaking effort to eliminate any distance between art and real life led artists to a kind of a self-effacing and guilt-ridden self-conception, assimilating them with ordinary production engineers. Facing growing criticism from various proletarian artists' unions, who were in fact doing the bidding of the Bolshevik leadership, especially the notorious RAP, R-A-P-P, many constructivists were tempted or even forced to justify their socially acclaimed preeminence by showcasing the usefulness of their work based on criteria set by Soviet government. If the production of steel or shoes can be collectively organized under a 5-year plan, why shouldn't this model not be adopted for poetry, music, plastic arts? However, their conceding that artistic contribution was to be measured by criteria of social utility as defined by political decision-making has proven fatal to them. As conditions were increasingly shaped, on the one hand, by the imperative of absolute devotion to the common cause of socialism, and on the other, by the rampant apprehension about real or imaginary threats to the revolution, every idea about the utility of art was determined by the need to turn artwork into an invisible weapon that the proletarian state could deploy to vanquish its omnipresent enemies. Soon, the proletarian associations of artists and writers started to imperatively require from artists to effectively organize the psyche of the toiling masses in the direction of the ultimate tasks of the proletariat, setting thus to them the specific political task which their work was to achieve, engineering the souls to the appropriate direction. It is no wonder, then, that constructivists' art started to be considered as pretentious and unintelligible by workers, a definite proof of the artist's inherent bohemian elitism, or as melancholic and pessimistic at a time when the masses required optimism, another clear proof of their ties with bourgeois advocates of anarchical libertarianism with shady cosmopolitan affiliations. Constructivists were summarily stigmatized and silently removed from all positions of power. Their work was purged and excluded from public exhibition, their activity scrutinized by the infamous secret police of the Stalinist regime. The triumphal restoration of representational art in public aesthetics, with socialist realism imposed by decree as the official and exclusive aesthetic doctrine in 1934, was just the final confirmation, the tombstone of the crushing defeat suffered by the Russian avant-garde. In this way, Stalinist totalitarianism pushed the Soviet state closer than any other regime to the realization of the authoritarian model of Plato's dystopian republic. Henceforth, the Soviet police would only allow hymns to the socialist motherland and accolades to its heroes. All the above do not imply, of course, that what Benjamin had in mind when coining the idea of communism's politicizing art was the subjection of aesthetic value to political absolutism. But what actually we can conclude from the above is that as long as politicizing art amounts to a teleological dependence of artistic creation from politics, no emancipatory results may ever be expected. Only politicization meant as materially actualizing a political scheme of freedom may offer a promise of emancipation. And the Russian avant-garde left us with too many such promises to be fulfilled in a future yet to come. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.